Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek Podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese, and I'm flying solo this week, but I have with me my very special guest, Sue from Women at Warp, a Roddenberry podcast. We're going to be talking about Women at Warp, what they do and why they do it, and the importance of women in Star Trek. It's all a part of this month's theme, Women's Future History. You're listening to episode 28, Woman at Warp, Part 1. Stick around. Well, here we are. This is so exciting for me. Women at Warp is a great podcast that you've all heard me talk about before on this show. I will say I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I prefer Women at Warp. My guest is trying not to laugh because I haven't introduced her yet.
Too late.
Oh no! Who are you? It's Sue from Women at Warp. What are you doing here?
I thought I was invited.
Oh, right. That's right. I'm so glad you're here, Sue. If you have not been around the Roddenberry podcast verse enough to have heard Women at Warp, you might need an introduction to Sue. I will just, off the top of my head, just kind of come up with something here. Sue that might have some similarity to what you might read at womenatwarp.com. Sue is a lifelong Star Trek fan and has been a member of the online fan community since the days of Usenet, searching daily for new Picard Crusher fanfic. She was definitely much too young to be on Usenet. Sue has a deep and abiding love of fandom history and has written and spoken on the subject for various outlets, and she'll gladly take any unwanted old zines off your hands. She's appeared on panels at DragonCon, Star Trek Las Vegas, New York Comic Con, and check it out, the Paley Center for Media, among others. Although Trek is her first love, Sue has been known to cross the streams and is active in myriad fandoms. Little nerd code for you there. And New York City theater professional by day, Sue keeps herself occupied between podcasts and work by researching and creating new cosplay and caring for her clouder, Oswin, Catalina, and, we love this one, Tilly. Find her on Twitter at Spoutor. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. I was telling Sue before the rest of you got here. Welcome, by the way. That it's cool. It's cool to be, hearing your voice and talking back to you, and you can hear me this time.
Yep.
It's nice. So I gave you the intro from the website, but tell us a little bit about Women at Warp and what you do there.
Sure. So Women at Warp started about 6 years ago. We're actually coming up on our 6th anniversary this month in March.
Congratulations.
And thank you. The history is, it started with 4 of us, myself, Andy, Grace, and Jara. And we had all come to know each other a little bit by sort of just being around fandom, guesting on each other's podcasts, working together on other projects. And it was Andy, actually, who kind of took a look around the Star Trek podiverse and said, why is it so many dudes?
I've asked myself the same question on this show.
Oh, especially because when you really look at the fan history of Star Trek, it has been driven by women in pretty much every space. So that's what really inspired the creation of Women at Warp. And this past summer, we expanded our crew and added Eliza, Kennedy, and Sarah to the mix. So there are 7 of us who rotate through. We're not usually all on the show at the same time because that'd be a lot. But we explore Star Trek from an intersectional feminist perspective, which, makes some people hate us right off the bat, but we prepared for that, so that's fine.
That's great. Explain to the audience, please, what you mean by an intersectional feminist perspective.
So, intersectionality is when you realize that there are multiple factors that can increase, or that can affect, rather, a person's marginalization. So, for, let's say, a Black woman, they are at the intersection of woman and Black.
Right.
So Black people are marginalized and women are marginalized. So when those two things intersect, it becomes an added element of that marginalization. And those, of course, aren't the only ones. We're talking about race and gender and mental health and sexual orientation and all of these different aspects, ability and disability, that can affect someone as they go through their daily life, as they live in our society. So when we talk about intersectional feminism, it is looking at things, critiquing from a feminist perspective that takes these things into account. So intersectional feminism is taking into account the things that are harder for women of color, or for queer women, or for non-cis people, and not just, the white feminist perspective.
Right. And that's really important, because I think, one of the things that I talk about a lot in my work is about all those various dimensions of life that we experience our humanity, we live our humanity in its depth and in its breadth, right? So we talk about not just who we are as humans very broadly and very generally, but also very deeply for all those factors that come together to make us who we are, right? And that all of those things are a part of the people who we are, whom God loves exactly as we are, right? And so I think that's great, and that's one of the things that I get from, and that I enjoy learning as I listen to the podcast, thinking about how those dimensions of our humanity intersect with one another, just generally, right? We so often can define ourselves so simplistically, and particularly when you're talking about, in the realm of marginalization, you're talking about a space where you can tend to emphasize one thing over another, or be blind to something that somebody's dealing with, because you're not seeing the ways, not just that they're in multiple categories, but how those categories interact with one another.
Exactly, yeah.
So I love that about the conversation. I think Star Trek's a really good place to do that. 6 years is a long time to be doing this. How have you found it challenging to carry such a thematically complex conversation forward for that period of time?
No, not really. One smart thing logistically that we did is that we only come out every other week.
Oh, see, I should learn from you.
But really that cuts down on editing time. The thing is, we once, actually, the first time we talked about religion on the show, believe it or not, one of the comments that we got was, this isn't really what you do. What does this have to do with feminism?
Wow.
And it was interesting to me, because the way we have all discussed it is that we could literally talk about anything, because our show is about the perspective we're coming from, not necessarily the topics we cover. Although we do cover a lot of topics you would expect when you hear intersectional feminist perspective, but we could discuss anything, and because it's us discussing it, it fits in with what we do, if that makes sense.
Yes, it really does.
And there are, over 800 episodes of Star Trek now, so we're set for a while.
Yeah, we are. Well, and, we do, it's the same thing around here, we always just sort of get together and have nerd conversations, and because we share a Christian worldview perspective, stuff, and we have that in mind as we're talking about it, stuff just emerges and comes out. Sometimes we can think in advance, here is a topic related to Christian worldview that we can discuss, adjacent to this Star Trek. But particularly when we're doing, a new episode of Discovery every week, something like that, we kind of have to let the material lead us. And it's amazing what we find. And it's amazing with any kind of worldview perspective, with any kind of lenses that you put on. It's amazing how many ways that can enhance your vision, and how you can enhance that vision in yourself too by listening to others' perspectives as well, which I think is really great, because you have such a diverse collection of people around your particular table. I guess talk to us a little bit about who's on the team and why they're there and what they bring from their different perspectives.
Oh wow, I mean, that's a lot.
Generally.
Yeah, when we first started, Andy is first time Trek on Twitter, and she was literally watching Star Trek for the first time. She still is. So I would say that at least at the beginning was probably our most different perspective, in that she's watching it for the first time now in this time period and doesn't have what I call nostalgia goggles.
Right.
And you know, one example of that is The Inner Light.
Oh, please tell.
Well, you know, in general, the fans love this episode. It's considered one of the best episodes, right? But when Andy first said that to me that she hated that episode before we even started the podcast, I was like, I'm sorry, what? And when you think about it, this is assault on Picard.
Yeah.
Because he didn't consent to this. There are major consent issues. He's essentially being gaslit the entire time that he's on that planet.
Wow.
And like it's just, the more you think about it, the more disturbing that story actually is.
Wow. That's fascinating.
So, you know, it's that sort of thing. We come from, especially now with all 7 of us, we have not all white people, which was a wonderful change. You know, we've got people with different religious backgrounds, people with different family backgrounds, people with different educational focuses, even with different interests. Means that we pick up on different things in an episode, but because we all have an intersectional feminist philosophy, really, we sort of end up in a lot of the same places. We might disagree about certain different things, how to read an episode, how to interpret it, but, you know, we're not going to be arguing over, you know, was this assault or wasn't it? You know, and it's kind of interesting. One of the comments that we get every now and then, you know, because podcast reviews are a thing, is that it's just an echo chamber of people saying yes to one another.
Oh, yeah.
But like there are plenty of things we disagree on when we're talking about it, but we're not at each other's throats.
Yeah.
You know, the thing is, oh, I see where you're coming from, but I think this. And I think the internet is much more expecting like a cat fight when a bunch of women disagree. And that's not how the world is.
No, it's not. And it's not how the world should be, for sure.
Right.
And I mean, that's something that is so important to me and special, I think, about these things that can bring us together in conversation. And something that we've talked about on the show before too is, you know, a principle that Gene Roddenberry talked about that I really agree with is that, you know, one sign of sort of human maturity is when we can not only just accept our differences, but celebrate them. Be glad that we're disagreeing. You know, he talked to. There's a book called God and. It's by a Jesuit priest, Father Sweeney, and he interviews all these different people about God. And he just sits down and talks to them and asks them some of the same questions and then, about God, and then sees where the conversation goes. Gene Roddenberry was one of the people, and in that interview, he said, you know, that he believed in the possibility. He liked the idea of all of us sort of transitioning into sort of one collective consciousness, right, and becoming one with the all, as he said. And then he said, but I find myself stepping back from that and saying, better we should have the loveliness of disagreeing. And I've always really liked that phrase, the loveliness of disagreeing. I don't think it's something that is very popular in Christian culture. Even though we are a really diverse group of people. If you just take all the people in the world who would say, yes, I do my best to follow Jesus, right? You will get people from every nation. You will get people from all kinds of different backgrounds who have all kinds of different ways of connecting with what it means to follow Jesus and have all kinds of different life experiences. Yet, for some reason, all these different segments of Christian culture have a tendency to want to homogenize that experience and make of it a very, very monochromatic thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think anything that we do that does that sort of celebrating of diversity, of getting with people who may have different ideas than us, and just saying, oh wow, that's a different perspective, and not getting defensive about it.
Yeah.
Not getting angry about it, but just listening. I think that's incredibly important. So I love that you do that well enough that it flies by some people's radar.
Well, there's also the degree to which there is disagreement, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of part of the discourse that, you see now on the internet, bunch of buzzwords right there. But like the memes you see every now and then that say, we can have different opinions. An opinion is whether pineapple belongs on pizza. An opinion is not whether, a trans person has the right to live.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's plenty of things we can disagree about, but it's the big picture stuff, the morality stuff, the philosophy stuff, maybe not even philosophy, but the goals and the end results that we kind of want to get to as a people, that I think, that is where the bigger agreement lies, and like the little stuff in between are where the disagreements go.
Yeah, it's about the larger human story, right? It's about how we occupy this planet together, and like from my perspective, like the central call of the Christian life is to love your neighbor. And we had on our show last week Natalie Atwell, who is the wife of David Atwell, who's one of our co-hosts, and she said something way back that David related to me back in the early days of this podcast that I've hung on to ever since, which is, how can you love your neighbor if you're not willing to listen to their story? And I just think that's so profound and so important to listen to one another and respect one another's stories, and then and respect one another's stories. I think that's a really big key, that you may disagree with somebody doctrinally within or without your faith, right? Whatever that may be. But you may disagree on some really important issues, whether they're political issues or philosophical issues or what have you. But there are basic things about dignity and respect and equality and rights that are about loving our neighbors, that are really about seeing another person as a human being first, and not as whatever labels we might put on them.
I might be taking the neighbor analogy a little too far right now, but
I don't know if you
got me thinking. I'm reading a book right now called The Color of Law, and it's all about how housing laws essentially segregated America.
Right.
And we're talking about disagreements, we're talking about the larger human story, talking about listening to your neighbor, and then I think about how our country and our government, which is led by people who call themselves Christians, spent so much time and energy making sure that they only had neighbors who looked just like them.
Yes. And there we go again, and that's I think, I don't know if it's the central flaw or the central fault of Christian culture, but it's one of the most fundamental things, is the consistent inability to see a neighbor in every person, and that desire to be around people who look like us, who sound like us, who act like us. This is why we have, dozens of denominations, hundreds of denominations, So, the great thing that we have as Star Trek fans is this sort of shared lexicon of ideas that we can use to talk about. And I think it's a good way to help communicate ourselves to one another and to help listen to one another, because there's a shared language that we have as a fan group. And you talked earlier about the importance of women in Star Trek fandom. And I want to go back to that because I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah.
How fundamental women are in influencing Star Trek. Well, I mean, going all the way back to Lucille Ball being the reason we have Star Trek to begin with, right?
Lucy saved Star Trek 3 times.
Good, yes. Go ahead. Please tell the listeners that story.
So a lot of people know that Lucille Ball ordered a second pilot for Star Trek after The Cage, which was unprecedented, right? So that's time number 1. Time number 2 is after that pilot, after the second pilot, she greenlit the show despite her board calling it financially untenable.
Wow.
And then in 1967, when her studio was losing $15,000 per episode on Star Trek, she sold Desilu to Paramount rather than cancel the show.
I'm going to cry.
Right? She really believed in this show. And a lot of the Lucy stories have only come to light more recently. So, you know, it's not super surprising to me that fans don't know all of it. Because it's maybe like around the late 90s that stuff started coming out. But then you've got, throughout the development of Star Trek, you've got D.C. Fontana, right? Who is, Dorothy Fontana essentially created the Vulcans and Vulcan culture.
Right.
You've got B. Joe Trimble, who with her husband John were the fans behind the letter writing campaign that saved Star Trek. You've got Deborah Langsam, who published one of the first fanzines called Spockanalia. You've got Jacqueline Lichtenberg, who organized and created the Star Trek Well Committee that any fan across the world could write to and find out information on their local fan clubs. You've got, you know, Joni Winston, who was instrumental in the first conventions with Deborah Langsam, with Sandra Marshak, and it's just lists and lists and lists of women. Shirley Mayuski ran the Well Committee for years and years. That it's lists, tons of women were instrumental in Star Trek fandom, and you know, people joke, but it's kind of true that, you know, we have Star Trek still today because a bunch of fans were writing Kirk, Spock, /fic in the 70s in the zines.
That's right.
So,
I mean, that's so true. And so many people, and this is the thing that puzzles me, okay? It kind of boggles my mind. Maybe you have more insight into this than I do, because you clearly are a better historian of this segment of fan history than I am. How does it happen? How does the shift take place when we have such a woman-led fan community? How does fandom, I mean, you know, nerddom in general, but particularly Star Trek, how does it become a place where it's mostly dominated by men by the time, you know, you and I come along?
Oh, I would argue that fandom is not. Online spaces might be, but I would say that at least Star Trek fandom is not male dominated right now.
It's not now, no. But I mean, do you remember a time when it seemed like women in fandom had to kind of prove themselves that they could be
absolutely.
True nerds?
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if this has a name, but there's definitely proof, right? History, it happens over and over again, of when a field, like a professional field, is seen to be of value, it stops being women dominated and starts being male dominated. This is true of computer science. It used to be all women. It became an important thing, shifted to being male dominated. Math. At NASA, like all of the computers, the physical, like people computers, were all women.
Right.
You know, and it happens over and over again. Chefs, right? When it becomes of value, it becomes a male field, right? In heteronormative terms, in very broad general terms.
Right, absolutely.
Don't
sure.
at me. But I think the same sort of thing can be thought of with fandom. It became a block that had buying power, that had a lot of, in general, had disposable income, and it became just sort of assumed. Like Star Trek was a show in the 60s, was a show for housewives, and like
really?
I would say post Star Wars. Right? It became this like nerd boys in the basement idea of who Star Trek fans were.
Get a life.
And it's just inaccurate. It's never been accurate.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I mean, you talk about I hadn't known about this before, about the sort of men sort of overtaking things when it becomes important. I mean, that's an angle on things I hadn't really heard before. We a couple of episodes.
So many air quotes in that very unprepared description, by the way.
Yes, right. But I think you're I think you're definitely onto something there, and it's really interesting to see, when you grow up with things a certain way, you kind of expect they've always been that way. Just last week, Natalie was on here talking about what counts as masculinity and what counts as femininity. And that idea isn't, the idea that we have as Americans really isn't all that old and is actually very American.
Yeah.
And so when,
even the pink and the blue is recent and used to be the other way.
Exactly. It was kind of controversial because it was originally that blue was for girls and pink was for boys, and people were like, no, it should be the other way. And then there was all kinds of conversations about green and yellow and other colors and whatever, and somehow this stuck.
And I have a friend who is an self-described action figure scholar. Nice. Who they've been on the show a couple times, and they talk about how the advent of boys and girls aisles in the toy store were to sell more toys.
Right.
And that is also like late 70s, early 80s.
Right. That's when it's invented, because that's when, you look back at old movies and stuff, and there's just toys on the shelves, right? But then when we're growing up, it's like there's a pink aisle. Yeah. And then there's a
blue aisle.
Blue, muddy, gray, brown, green aisle. And that's
the Barbies and the superheroes.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, and so much of the stuff that we think is so normative. Anyway, the thing I'm getting to is we just recently did an episode on the film Woman in Motion. Have you seen this?
I have not had a chance to see it yet.
You need to see it.
Because I'm not going to a movie theater.
Well, no, it's streaming. It's streaming.
Yeah, I know. I just haven't had the chance.
I'm not going to a movie theater either. I'm right there with you. Mike and I were talking about it. We loved it. It's so good. You have to go see it. Like, after we get done recording, go watch it. It's great. But the interesting thing was that, it's all about Nichelle Nichols' involvement in NASA. And, she walks in and sees that behind the scenes, there are women. And there are people of color, like, behind the scenes doing the stuff that makes NASA run. But the public face of NASA, people don't see that. And the reason for that, a big reason for that, is that the Air Force decided, who they were going to promote to go be astronauts. And the Air Force, well, they tended to send white men. And in those spaces where, like you say, as stuff becomes important, men kind of take over. That's not natural. That's not something that just happens. That's orchestrated. People do that on purpose, and it's happened over and over and over again. And there right there was a clear example where people might think, oh, of course Nichelle had to get women involved in the field, because every field is dominated by men. Only when they make it so. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing for me in fan culture, that we've gone through a time where women kind of have to prove their nerd credentials, and we try to, and men try to make it into a boys' club. Is it, is Star Trek? I mean, looking at Star Trek, we can look at the ways that it falls short, especially in its earliest days, in so many of these areas of representation and equality. But what do we see is Star Trek maybe, have they been a little bit ahead of the curve, do you think? Because of that, and because of the focus on inclusion, or have we not lived up to that ideal in Star Trek fan culture?
I think it depends, which sounds like a cop-out.
That's usually the answer.
So here's a theological term for you that I like to bring out whenever I have this conversation, and that's hermeneutics.
Yes.
Yeah. The difference of looking at something in context of when it was written or released in terms of media, when it was released or produced, versus looking at it and experiencing it now.
Right.
Right. So when you look at like the original series, it is often, but not always, very progressive for its time.
Right.
Looking at it now, some of those same things we would have called progressive in the 60s are regressive in 2021.
Right.
Right. So, but that's something to discuss. And again, something that we hear from the detractors, is you're too hard on TOS. Think about the time it was made in. And, if you listen to our episodes, you'd know that we do.
Yeah.
You can acknowledge that something was progressive at one time while still talking about how it's problematic today and why it's problematic today. That's part of the discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's an important part too. I think off air, Mike and I think we're even talking about, and see if you concur with this, that we look back and see like the women on the original series wearing miniskirts and think, oh, they're sexing up their women, which certainly we saw done in our generation of Star Trek. But
the miniskirt, if I may.
Yeah.
the miniskirt was controversial even at the time.
Right.
Right. If you look back, you can find promotional shots from before the show started airing with Grace Lee Whitney in pants in a uniform that looked very much like what the women were wearing in The Cage in the original pilot.
Right.
And according to her in interviews, she's the one that requested the miniskirt.
Yes.
And there was even, there's the argument to this day of the miniskirts are empowering versus the miniskirts are objectifying. And there are letters saying both in Letters to Star Trek, which was published in the 70s. It's a contemporary account. So, not everybody agreed back then either. And the thing that a lot of this comes down to, and I think this came up last week as well, is the choice.
Yeah.
Right? The problem is not the miniskirt. The problem is not the pants. The problem is the absence of a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we get to Next Generation, and, we tried to have men wearing skirts. And one time we had Tasha Yar wearing a skirt, right? And eventually, like, Deanna ends up in a pants and shirt uniform, right?
Yep.
How does that conversation enter in there? I mean, should it be a space where you really do have an option that these uniforms are acceptable, wear whichever one you want to? Is that a better space for us to live in Starfleet world?
I mean, I think so, but I've never been in any pseudo-military organization, really,
Right.
unless you count the 501st.
But, for those of you who don't know the other franchise very well.
But, it seems to me that uniform variants would exist for a reason, and wear whichever one you're most comfortable with.
And it fits the job you're doing.
Right.
That's the other part of it, functionality, right? And
yeah, I mean, if I wear a skirt most of the day on the ship, but I got to beam down to an ice planet, I want to put on some pants.
Right. And you should have that option available to you.
Right.
You shouldn't have to cling to your commanding officer to shield yourself from the wind.
Yeah, but
right.
I mean, to go back to the initial question is,
yes.
Was Star Trek ahead of its time? I think they tried to be for the most part, but the problem is that they didn't have a very diverse writer's room.
Right.
So as much as they tried, they were going to fail because they generally had one perspective, or at least one dominant perspective. Right. That being said, the women of Next Gen, especially the later seasons when you've basically just got Troy and Crusher, get a lot of flack for being in, quote, nurturing roles, right? And the problem with those characters, man, I'm talking myself in circles tonight, is that it devalues nurturing. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right, exactly.
But also at the time, those are traditionally feminine roles.
Right.
Right? So there's a balance you've got to strike there. And again, it's that there's no other option.
Right.
Right? If Tasha Yar had stuck around, maybe the conversation would be different. In DS9, you don't really have that issue. You've got women in non-traditional, non-stereotypically feminine roles.
Right.
Voyager, kind of the same way, although I think they tried to balance Janeway out with Kes a little bit, at least at the beginning. And I think through all of this time, I really do think they were trying. Yeah. And then we get to Enterprise, in which I think it was Brandon Braga, but I'm not positive. Again, don't at me, who said, we haven't really focused on white men in a while when they were creating Enterprise.
Oh, wow. See, that's not a very Star Trek perspective.
Yeah.
That's not.
And what's happening now in the new series is that you have those different perspectives behind the scenes on the creative teams, as directors, on the set, in the cast.
As the writers.
So it's bringing new ideas, and it's bringing so many more people on the ship, behind the scenes, and they're just there, and it's not a conversation. Even on Voyager, it was occasionally a conversation. I think back to, I think it's a first season episode where they say we're meeting an alien and they're a very patriarchal society, and there's this whole scene where Janeway has to explain herself being a woman who's a captain because this alien culture can't handle it. And they're clearly talking to the fanboys. Right.
Yes, I remember that episode. Yes, very much.
Or we could have not done that. That would have been great.
That would have been great. Yeah. I've talked about that before on the show too, that I think the best form of inclusion is when people are just included. And we don't have to comment on it or talk about it or explain it or apologize for it. We just do it. And people are just there. And they're right along with everybody else and not treated any differently. I think that's the most important kind of representation we have, instead of having, a very special episode, right?
Right. And it really is about inclusion, right? Yes. It's not about just being there in the background, being included in the scenes, having a character that has something to add to the situation, that has a part in the plot. On a panel a couple years back, Aliza, one of my co-hosts, said, diversity without inclusion is tokenism.
Yes.
So you really do want to focus. You want to focus on inclusion, not just diversity. You don't want to just get the people there. Once they get there, once people get in the door, include them, listen to them, bring them into the conversation, bring them into the story. Yes.
And that is so vitally important. And going back to what you said about the early writers' rooms in TNG, I mean, or in original series is what you're talking about, but I mean, even up through TNG, Deep Space Nine, whatever, we have, just mostly a lot of white guys. And there's only no matter how much you try, and no matter how sincere you are, and no matter how much you even might do research or study or whatever, there's only so much you can do to really write from someone else's perspective, and to really give a full expression to someone who is very different from you as a character. That's a very hard thing to do. Some writers can pull it off, better than others. But I think everybody is going to eventually run into the limitations of trying to do that, which I think makes it difficult for people in a writing space. Let's say they're writing for Star Trek. Let's say they're writing a Star Trek novel, whatever they're doing, right? And they're not, maybe they are a white male, maybe they're a white female. They're writing characters who are different from them one way or another, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do they confront that challenge in your view? How might they confront that challenge in a way where they can write those characters the best they possibly can, recognizing that they're always going to have that limitation of perspective?
I am not a writer, certainly not a TV writer.
Right. But you're a reader. You're a reader of culture, right?
I'm a consumer.
So you can say something about how they might adapt themselves in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't believe write what you know. I think that is garbage advice. But read and listen, and then once you have written something, run it by people. And I don't mean like, hey, one black friend, please read this black character I wrote. Like, right. No, there are people who have this job. They're called sensitivity readers or something to that effect. Hire them and pay them for their time. That's how that works. Nice. If you know somebody who has the perspective that you're trying to write from, mm-hmm. write with them, bring them into it, work nice. Together. The thing is, when you're writing from a marginalized perspective, even if as a marginalized person, there is no one Black experience. There is no one autistic experience. There is no one queer experience. There is no one female experience, right? These communities, these groups are not monoliths. And to avoid that, my thought is the more the merrier. Mm-hmm. But also from one of my favorite YouTubers is Jessie Gender, and she did a video recently on Sia's movie music and like the issues with autistic representation in that film, and talked about how you make a character universal by making them specific.
Yes.
And yeah. I think that's a weird thing to think about, but instead of trying to represent an entire community by painting broad strokes, you give a character idiosyncrasies or quirks, and that's what makes them relatable.
Because it makes them a person.
Yes.
Who is defined by something other than that thing that is most obvious about them that makes you different from them.
And like, again, not a TV writer, but my gut would say write people.
Yeah.
Like when it comes down to it, write people. Yeah. And let your actors bring it. Mm-hmm. From their perspectives and the way they want to play it out, because hopefully you've got an inclusive cast as well.
Right. Well, and I can say, as a writer myself, I can say I think you're bang on, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's one thing that we don't often think about. We don't often consider is that when our definition of a character that we might be writing, or a character that we might be seeing on the screen, or just another human being who maybe is in our family or on the bus. Mm-hmm. Since you're in New York, I have to use the on the bus. However we might look at that person, as even if we're trying to be helpful, compassionate, thoughtful, all those things, if the foremost thing in our minds is that thing about them that we need to be accepting of, or we need to, manage our response to in some way, right? That we think, as if that's the foremost thing in our minds, we really are still doing some othering mm-hmm. there.
Yeah.
One of the things we talk about on the show is othering versus one anothering. And that really we're called to one anothering, not to othering, to treating others as we would wish to be treated, to loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that's a kind of, I think that's kind of a sneaky form of othering that can be difficult to shake, but is important to work on. And I think you're hitting on something very good there, to look at characters as people first and look at other people as humans first. And from a Christian perspective, I would say as human beings whom God loves. Those of you listening who are going, okay, but why are we having this whole conversation about all this stuff? Folks, if we can talk about how a television show needs to be inclusive of all these people, if we can talk about how a novel or a universe or whatever needs to have people not just represented but included, not just tokens but part of the story, then what does that say about the story that we all live? What does that say about the narrative that we are a part of, the narrative that God writes through humanity? And that is a narrative that is rooted in love, in the God who is love, whose love encompasses all, really encompasses, includes all. Just like Sue was talking about, that it's not tokenism, right? It's actual inclusion, that God's love for your neighbor, who may be different from you, yes, even them, is as deep and as real and as pure and as all-consuming as it is for you. And so therefore, do your best to let that come out in the way you treat your neighbor. That's so vitally important, I think, to living a Christian life, to living a good human life, as though there was a difference, which hopefully there isn't. But there you go. So this has been a fascinating discussion, as always, tightly scripted. But it has been an absolute joy to have you on here. Would you please just let our audience know where they can find you and Women at Warp, and to hear more of this kind of insightful conversation about women in Star Trek?
Sure. If you are looking for me, you can find me on Twitter at Spaltor, Spaltor. If you are looking for Star Trek and feminism, hit up womenatwarp.com or Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Women at Warp. And if you would like photographs of my cats, Instagram at noodlebeanpotato.
Nice. Oh, I'm going there. That's awesome. Well, Sue, it has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Hey, I've got an idea.
Yeah.
Why don't you come back for another episode this month? Would you like to do that?
What?
Yeah. Would that be cool? Because I think we
Sure.
got more we can talk about.
If y'all aren't sick of me, why not?
Not at all. Not at all. And maybe Tilly will have more to say next time too.
Oh my goodness.
So there we go. Look for that in the future. Folks, this has been so much fun, and I really appreciate you being here. Next week, we will actually be talking to some of the production crew from the film Woman in Motion, which we have talked about on the show before, and they heard our episode and they want to come on. So I'm really excited to be talking to them next week. So I hope you will join us next week. In the meantime, please like, share, comment, rate, and subscribe. And also send us your questions and your ideas. Gospel According to Star Trek on Twitter and Facebook, or gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to discuss your question on the show. So that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, I've been Kevin Sinise. My guest is Sue from Women at Warp. And as Jesus said in John 10:10, live long and prosper. See you next time.